Now I want to shift a bit. We've been looking at hypocrisy through a variety of authors and philosophical perspectives on it, and basically come to the view that it's a bad thing, right? It maybe in some cases we might be able to generate something where it's not so bad, as we saw with in the one video where I talked about, maybe you're fundraising and you're dealing with rich guy who's kind of an awful guy, but you act the hypocrite in order to get more money for a good cause. So we've looked at that there might be a case. Well, this is a larger one, and it's in the tradition of saying things like, well, sometimes bad behavior and evil behavior can lead to good, right? There's that great thing in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, right? The Gollum problem, shall we say? Here's this kind of this awful little critter. It's kind of a pathetic little critter and all that. He was once a hobbit and gets corrupted and all that. But the role that he plays in the story is that while he is, as Sam keeps saying, there's no good in him. He's just an awful guy. And we're never really clear at the end if that's entirely true, but it seems to be true because all he wants is this ring, which has corrupted him. But in his pursuit of the ring, what happens? He actually helps someone, namely the hero, I guess, Frodo, who can't actually destroy the ring. Gollum's lust for the ring leads to the ring's destruction, and a net good for the Middle-earth society, because it leads to the destruction, at least of a certain version of evil. Not all versions of evil, but a metaphysical version of evil is destroyed in Middle-earth. And in the end, basically the upshot is fairly straightforward but controversial, namely that out of this evil comes good, right? So Tolkien is interesting because that cuts against, some pretty fundamental perspectives, like especially like as we've seen of Aquinas, where he's like, no, the sin is sin. It's never profitable. Not like making money, but it's never a good thing, right? It's always kind of bad. It might not be that terrible, like as in a venial sin, or it could be really terrible as in a mortal sin, but you don't want to say sin can lead to good stuff. Well, we're going to have a look at a tradition that says, hey, from our vices, good can happen. So let us call this kind of like this Gollum kind of thing. Are we all like a little Gollum in a society rooted in little golems? Okay, so we're going to look at a thinker named Bernard Mandeville. So we have a little picture of him over there. Born in 1670, so he's Dutch. He's in the Netherlands. He's originally a Dutch person born there, but I wouldn't really call him a Dutch thinker in the sense, because he was what we might say is like an Anglophile, right? He really admired a lot of stuff about England, and he wanted to learn the language and go live there, which he did, and work and write in English, and he died in England some 60 odd years later. Now, we don't talk a lot about Mandeville, but he's a really interesting guy, and he was, he had quite a bit of influence in his own shortly after his death. His work was one of those kind of annoying pieces that just doesn't go away, and people spend a lot of time trying to refute it because it's upsetting, because he's basically putting across the idea that out of bad, selfish behavior, good things can happen. Okay, so and we're going to look at a little bit of his work. In 1705, we get this little pamphlet appears called The Grumbling Hive, or Knaves Turned Honest. And he's going to develop this pamphlet. And so if we think, we'll switch our pictures here. A few years after 1705, about 10 years afterwards. So after the pamphlet of 1705, you can see we have this work that it's renamed. It's a little poem. It's renamed The Fable of the Bees, or Private Vices, Public Contrast. Private vices have public benefits. And he basically reworked this little document, right? And it got larger and larger. Then it becomes a bloated kind of monster. As he keeps working it, people object. He works it and works it and works it and keeps re-releasing it. And eventually, it's not long where where in some years later it's denounced. This is a public nuisance, and there's a number of reasons why people thought it was a public nuisance. But think about it, from our bad stuff, that's where the good stuff can come from. Not solely, but that we don't really want to get rid of all our bad stuff. That's the idea of the grumbling hive or the fable of the bees. We'll look at that later. But the basic idea is when people say, oh, if we only had a society that was totally honest and everybody was good, what would that actually look like if you really had human beings all become good and virtuous? What would you end up with? That's the thought experiment that Mandeville explores in The Grumbling Hive, the fable of the bees. And so in about 1725, the last review of this, with commentary and a defense. So he's working this thing up into, and of course he's going to die shortly after that, but he works it up. So what starts off as kind of a joke, you could make, you could say that it's a bit of a joke, and eventually it gains traction. People are reacting to it, the author reacts back, and it goes back and forth. He declared a public nuisance, and he reacts by expanding it even more into what becomes really a philosophical work. A treatise on what we might today call history, sociology, philosophy. It's a whole bunch of stuff going on there, mass psychology, all kinds of things happening. But we don't talk a lot about Mandeville today, which is kind of too bad because he's a really interesting thinker. And David Hume and a number of big name authors that we do talk about today regarded Mandeville, as a serious and very interesting thinker. So I'll change this thing again, and in 1732 we get another work, an inquiry into the origin of honor, and also this stuff about war. You can have a look at the title here. Basically, Mandeville just keeps on exploring this idea that from our bad sides can come all this good stuff, and that's what makes him so interesting. If you recall, again, in Aquinas, or question 111, on dissimulation and hypocrisy, it was pretty clear. Hypocrisy, and these are vices, and vices are kinds of sins. Vices are opposed to virtues. Hypocrisy and lying, that's opposed to the virtue of truth. And these are sins, and sins are bad. We should never say sins are good. We should never look for goodness in sin. Aquinas is not happy about that idea. We can look for levels of bad in sin where it's not so bad or whatever, but don't look for good in sin. And of course, Aquinas, has that ultimately virtues are ultimately connected with God. So God has a role in public life as a kind of glue that holds society together. And then to come along and say, not only is it human virtue that holds society together, but Mandeville and people like Hobbes and Hume even said that some of our vices are important for holding society together. Not that it's everything, but that vices are important elements of the glue in society. Well, this shocked a lot of people because it was a kind of atheism, and people thought it was almost a kind of satanic view to say that evil plays a role in the goodness of holding society together. So people were not clear how to take Mandeville, right? So some of them, sometimes people thought that, maybe he's being ironic. Maybe he's kind of like a Socrates guy and getting us to be more careful about our vices, because we could have perverted arguments that make them look like they could be the root of good, right? No, Mandeville is teaching us don't go down this path by showing us the path not to go down. So some people thought he was maybe doing that. He's an ironic figure or whatnot. But maybe he's just flatly mistaken. Maybe he thinks he's demonstrated something, but we got to look and find out where he went awry in his reasoning. So he's not being ironic. Yeah, he's being straightforward, but he's just wrong about everything he says. And our job is to figure this out, to counter all this, to show how God and virtue, that's the glue that holds society together. So it's very interesting. People were very concerned. Times were changing at this. There's an industrial revolution and scientific revolution. Lots of things were going. What is the glue that's holding society together? And when times are rough, in times of change, right? It was hard on a lot of people, the economic changes that were happening, the scientific changes, so lots of things were being upended. Well, some of the authorities worried that it would be very easy to see that what's holding society together is not, people's altruism and goodness, but it might be sort of the bad things about us. And we certainly don't want to have that. So yes, there were concerns about disruptions of power, and churches were worried. All kinds of people were worried about how society was changing. And then this stuff starts coming along. Is certainly not going to please the authorities as well. So he's a fairly subversive thinker. Even if some of his stuff might strike us as a little tame today, you have to go back and think of when he was writing and what he was saying. Much like when Shakespeare was writing about regicide, that just was totally wild in his day. So sometimes things that are really controversial at one time may not be later on, and of course some things very controversial today, would not be controversial at an earlier time. But the heart of what he's thinking is what I call this sort of little Gollum problem. Is that people like Mandeville and Adam Smith and Hume said that, lots of things come out of our virtues, but some things come out of our vices. And this large sort of scale and this aggregate of our private, of our private vices, if you aggregate them, you can get a public benefit. And that certainly would be contrary to a lot of Christian thought. That would have formed the background thinking of Mandeville's time. So let's look at this and see this curious thing about, from sin and vice and all that, can good come about? See you next video.